Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're broadcasting from tonight. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. Welcome to our first UQ Talks for the year. I am Tegan Taylor. I'm a journalist with ABC Radio National, a proud UQ alum, and your host and moderator for this series. International tensions are rising, conflicts are intensifying, and the economic benefits are already being felt here at home. Our Prime Minister is addressing the nation live as we speak. Our team are monitoring the coverage, and we will bring you the headlines as they happen, along with some analysis as well. We all want to know, what does the current international situation mean for global stability? Is it time we reevaluate the international rules-based order and our long-standing alliances? What would that look like for us here in Australia? And what kind of impacts would we then likely see on our daily lives? Well, lucky for you, we are joined by UQ experts who are here to unpack the current situation and break down where this global instability is headed and what it means for us. And you can be part of this discussion. You can ask your questions using the Q&A button on your screen. So before we jump in, I'd like to introduce our panel. Joining me here in the studio are Professor Shaha Hamyeri, a professor at UQ's School of Political Science and International Studies. Shaha is a political economist who studies the contemporary nature of geopolitical and geoeconomic rivalry and its impacts. Professor Katrina Lee Koo is head of school at UQ's School of Political Science and International Studies. Katrina's research is in the field of inclusive approaches to global peace and security. And Professor John Quiggin, a professorial research fellow at UQ's School of Economics. John is a research economist and a commentator on Australian economic policy. Safe to say, we have the right people in the room to unpack the current global situation tonight. So let's get into it. So John, I want to start with you. I think with the way people are feeling the current economic instability at the moment is at the Bowser, at the fuel prices. What, briefly, has led to this?
Well, we've seen the cut-off of oil from a bunch of Middle Eastern countries, essentially arising from the war between Israel and the US and Iran. The Iranians have responded by closing down most shipping through the Straits of Hormuz. That's reduced oil supplies. At the same time, sanctions on Russia, which is also a major exporter, have become increasingly effective, both sanctions in terms of seizing ships, but also Ukrainian sanctions in terms of blowing lots of stuff up.
So what kind of downstream effects are we likely to continue to see in the coming month or so?
Well, I think we've seen a big increase in the price of petrol, reflecting those oil price increases. That'll presumably be offset a little bit by the cut in fuel excise. But there's no reason, I think, to think that supplies are going to return to normal in the next month, or indeed for quite a number of months. So I think we can expect to see the current high prices and possibly even higher prices continuing into the future.
So as I said, the PM is currently addressing the nation, and that is currently underway. Just to give you a bit of context, because of course our panel aren't watching it because they're here with you right now. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says that Australia is not an active participant in the Iran war, but that our nation is paying higher prices because of it. He says he knows we're seeing price hikes reflected at the supermarket and service stations, and warns that there will be tough months ahead. No government can promise to eliminate the pressures that this war is causing. I can promise we will do everything we can to protect Australia from the worst of it. Shaha, what kind of actions could that include?
Well, I mean, the Australian government has already taken some steps, as John was saying. They've reduced the excise, so they're doing that. As I understand, also the government has got a task force that is looking for other forms of supply to bring into Australia. I'm not entirely sure whether they've been able to do that. Australia also has the capacity, if things got really dire, to leverage its gas exports. Australia is the world's biggest gas exporter. And if things got really tough, and we don't know how bad things are going to get at this point, we could try and barter oil supplies by using gas exports. I sincerely hope we don't get to that point, but this would be something that we could do down the line. But otherwise, I think the government is probably going to try and target the sources of inflation arising from from the limits to supply of oil. But there's not a whole lot that they could do because we are at the end of a very long supply line.
What kind of conversations would the Prime Minister and the Cabinet be having with their international counterparts if it came to that?
If it came to that, I think that firstly, under the Morrison government, the Australian government negotiated if you like, a petroleum reserve based in the United States. I'm wondering if they're talking about bringing some of that here to Australia at the moment to alleviate the pressure. So they could do that. They could negotiate with countries in Asia where most of our refined oil comes from, and try to ensure that we get our share as a part of that. And as I said, we have got some cards to play in this context if things got really tough. I'm sure that the government would want to see a swift resolution to this conflict in Iran, but we don't have any capacity to influence where that war is heading.
John, it didn't sound like the Prime Minister announced any material policy beyond what had already been announced, the halving of the fuel excise for a fixed period of time. Are the sorts of things that have currently been announced going to go far enough for everyday Australians?
Well, I think an important point is they've done nothing at all that would actually reduce demand. The cut in fuel excise means the impact on fuel supplies will be worse, not better. And so it's very similar indeed to the last address to the nation, which was Prime Minister Morrison's on the 13th of March 2020, in which he essentially said, don't worry about this, we have all the situation under control, great plans, well prepared, why don't you go to the football? And the following weekend, of course, we got an email saying, don't bother coming into the office, you'll be locked down for the foreseeable future. So we're really seeing, I think, as you said, a hope that the problem will go away. Prime Minister expressed that hope very optimistically a couple of weeks ago that the problem had been solved. If things go well, everything will look good. I think if we get a further bad shock, this talk won't come as that of a Prime Minister who was on top of the situation.
And I think given the damage to the infrastructure, energy infrastructure in the Middle East, as you say, even if the war ended tomorrow, there's still going to be some very significant disruptions to supply. They're going to last quite a long time.
Katrina, what are your concerns when you're looking at this situation?
Look, I think as John said, one of the key issues is that the Prime Minister needs to be seen to be showing leadership on this, and I think that's very much what tonight's announcement is about for him. It's about him coming out and saying to the nation that he understands the causes of this crisis and that he has a response in place. But I think what's going to really matter in the weeks and months ahead is that he fully understands the different kind of impacts that this has on different segments of our community. So he has to think very carefully about the different ways this crisis will affect different industries and industry groups, alongside different demographics, people in different geographic locations, and of course families and communities. And managing an equitable response and support for all of those different constituencies will be how he's judged in terms of his response.
On this idea of equity, what kind of groups are particularly vulnerable to these sorts of shocks?
Well, I think there's all sorts of crises that can emerge out of this, from food security, beyond just access to oil, the impact that it has on compounding issues, including interest rate rises for families. I mean, I think we need to think about not just this crisis, but the other cost of living crises that sit alongside and will be impacted by this. And to think very carefully, I think how each different group will be affected differently. So equity is about making sure that nobody gets left behind or is excluded in both the analysis and the response.
We're painting a really rosy picture for ourselves tonight, aren't we?
Well, of course, I mean, that's how things should be done. I haven't really seen equity as the driving force in this or recent governments. I think the response will be those groups who are loudest in their response and who are seen as the biggest sources of political vulnerability for the government.
I'm interested to talk about how well we could have anticipated this. Like some global shocks come out of the blue, or we have no control over them. Some, if you got your eyes on the signs, maybe we could have anticipated. Shaha, what were you seeing, say, 6 months ago?
Well, 6 months ago maybe was a bit easier to see this, but we've because of the war that happened a few months prior in the same region, But I think that if you go back a number of decades, there were, for quite a long time, there's been a shift towards, just-in-time forms of supply, towards emphasizing efficiency over, other potential goals. And for quite some time, some people have warned that, in the event of a crisis such as this one, you want to have something to fall back on. You could also say that maybe our experience with COVID should have taught us something in terms of not having the PPE, the personal protection equipment that we needed at the time, and lacking access to some pharmaceuticals as well. And perhaps there was an opportunity to build up our reserves. We've got some reserves, but they're not very substantial. They only last about a month. We have these other reserves that supposedly were negotiated with the United States, but we don't know how long they're going to take to get here if they get here. So maybe we could have done a bit more on that side of things. And we just need to shift our mindset, because the world is becoming a lot more challenging for everyone, not just for Australia. And you need to build the buffers in order to be ready at a time of crisis.
We talked a lot in the pandemic about pandemic preparedness and what countries need to be doing ahead of time. John, what does economic preparedness look like?
Well, I think, the big failure, we really, going back over this government and the previous government, Scott Morrison scores a lot here, is the failure to promote the transition away from oil. We've known for a long time it's dependent. Instead, we get Prime Minister Morrison talking about abolishing the weekend, the current government carving out exemptions for the largest and most fuel-efficient vehicles. So if we were Norway, we wouldn't be worried about the lack of petrol at all.
Although there is, to be fair, some limit to that. I mean, if you look at China, which is the country that has made the biggest strides in the green transition, they still rely for about 70% of their energy consumption on oil and gas. So there's still, and coal, sorry, on all these different sources. So it is very difficult to transition away from fossil fuels, but you're absolutely correct.
John?
Yeah, no, I think, the transition is certainly hard, but we knew we needed to start 10 years ago, and instead we have, particularly in transport, done nothing. The government strategy really relies entirely on fixing electricity and then buying offsets, hopefully, in the future. So there's really been no serious attempt to do this, and indeed the current budget was about to introduce a tax on electric vehicles.
Yeah.
So one of the things when you enrolled to come along to this event tonight, you could ask a question along sort of like what you're hoping to get out of it. And quite a few people were asking about the risk of a recession. How likely is it that that's the direction that we're headed in, John?
Well, ideally the Reserve Bank is dealing with these things, and so there's no reason why a shock to petrol prices should cause a recession. But that said, I haven't been impressed by the Reserve Bank's judgment here. That is, I would have said that even though the notion is that they're supposed to reduce inflation, that's supposed to refer to inflationary pressures generated within the Australian economy. So the response to an event like this should have been to hold off on interest rate increases. The statement came out of the Reserve Bank on the day of the increase, sort of implied that petrol price increases were an inflationary factor. The governor tried to clean up the next day and say, no, this wasn't anything to do with it. So obviously had to receive some flack about the fact that this was a wrong decision. But that's going to be a problem. I think if we have large-scale public spending, there'll be a lot of pressure on the Reserve Bank to raise interest rates again. And so it's really a case, though, that if we don't get misjudgments from the Reserve Bank, there's no reason why this shock is large enough to the Australian economy to cause a recession of itself.
What we're seeing here is something that's literally happening on the other side of the world, really affecting our day-to-day life here in Australia. What is it about the way that we've set up the globe in this era that leaves us vulnerable to something happening so far away having such a big impact on us?
Well, we've had 40 odd years of economic globalisation. The world has become incredibly economically integrated. Actually, Australia is in itself not as embedded in border-spanning value chains, as they call them, which are the very complex systems that have been created across borders that are the way in which most products and services, mainly products, are created these days. We're not so much embedded in that as some countries, but at the same time, we are still very much part of the global economy, which means that if there are problems within the global economy, we and everybody else suffers. And this is something that I think Trump has learned here pretty much to his detriment, because I don't think foresaw, or I'm sure someone told him, but maybe he didn't listen, that if you start, pushing certain dominoes in that very closely integrated world economy, other dominoes are going to fall as well. So you are affecting the price of energy, and then you have, fertilizers, and then you have other things, and then, people who make chips can't access certain metals that they need, and it goes on and on and on. So this is the world that we've created. It's a lot more fragile than it used to be. There are some benefits to that, of course, as well. But now I think we're at a point where a lot of governments are not prepared, and many people indeed are not prepared to take that chance anymore.
The period of economic sovereignty, though, was the exception. It really only ran for about 30 years from the outbreak of World War II to 1970. The depression we had in 1929 was generated outside the country. 1893, it's only in a very brief period that the national governments exerted control over national economies and managed to preserve full employment for that period. And of course ended actually somewhat before the 1973 oil shock, but that was the event that really symbolised it. But that settlement was already under stress then. But so it's not that this is a newly created global world, it's a recreation of the global world that prevailed, particularly in the years before World War One.
And there's a whole lot of levels of that interconnectedness that go beyond the kind of economic globalisation that mean that a lot of these crises do have knock-on effects outside of that. I mean, we can talk about everything from food security to human rights to the impact upon international law. There's a whole range of ways in which, one particular crisis can create or exacerbate or influence the ways in which we experience a whole range of public goods in our day-to-day lives.
Is there an example that stands out to you at the moment?
Look, I think about, I think about the interconnectedness, as we were talking about, of what this oil shock means for everything from food security. It can have impacts on family safety and communities. It can have all sorts of impacts that are often seen and unseen or sit above and below the surface.
So what we're seeing here is we're seeing a kind of very acute effect of a cluster of international movements. I'd love to talk a little bit about what we have kind of observed without getting bogged down in any particular conflict. I think the one that's top of mind at the moment when we're talking about fuel prices is what's happening in Iran, because that's where the fuel needs to come out of. That's what's being blocked at the moment. Katrina, a lot of the rhetoric around this has been about the departure from a rules-based order. What does that mean?
Well, a rules-based order is really a set of principles that states agree to abide by, whether it be through formal arrangements like international laws or treaties, conventions or informal arrangements, by which we accept a limit upon our sovereignty for the purposes of global stability or a level of global security. What we're seeing now is a move away from that. It's under significant pressure. It's in a period of transition. Some would say, towards a more transactional approach. Some would say towards a more raw power approach. But I think that is being brought out by a few things. I mean, firstly, we're seeing a sort of absence of US leadership. To some extent, has always upheld the rules-based order. So that erratic behaviour from the US means that order is coming under significant stress. We're seeing states renegotiate the way in which they kind of balance within their own minds power and consent. Their willingness to forego certain things for the purposes of collective security. So we're seeing an erosion of that. We're seeing a rise of new states who engage in the rules-based order but want to do so under a different set of terms or a different set of values. So I think it's not just what's happening right now that's causing that erosion. I think it's been on the horizon in different ways. But I think the current crisis really brings it into a sharper focus. But Shahar?
It's also important, though, that we're seeing a counter-movement, which is a new rules-based order centred on the European Union. A country like Canada, which previously was integrated with the US in a free trade agreement, is now saying, well, that obviously doesn't pay, we're going with the US. Australia, we had a bunch of disputes at our end of whether we could sell feta or not. We've signed a deal. South Americans have, although French farmers are still managing to hold it up a little while. So we're seeing quite a big movement to say the great powers of the world, Russia, China and the US, have clearly chosen the path of power. but the middle powers are looking to preserve a version of the world disorder. It'll be different because, as Katrina was saying, the previous world order was run by the US, and the US managed to make sure that the rules, although they upheld them mostly, were always interpreted in a way that benefited the US more than anybody else.
Yeah, and I wouldn't focus just on on Europe. And I mean, certainly Mark Carney in his recent speech earlier this year talked about the importance of multilateralism and of coalitions that are driven by certain value-based propositions. But I think we would also look at Asia and the way in which multilateralism has worked in Asia in a different kind of model for many decades now.
I mean, my view is that pretty much every country in the world, with the exception of the very few that were mentioned, the United States and to a lesser extent China, certainly Russia, pretty much every other country is actually interested in having some form of rules-based order. I don't think they're interested in going back to what was seen as a far more interventionist international order under recent US leadership, but they certainly want some rules. They don't want the powerful to be able to determine what happens in every domain. But I'm somewhat skeptical about whether, if the United States especially is determined to disrupt those arrangements. I'm very skeptical whether they can succeed. We saw that recently. The United States literally threatened, the United States government that is, threatened participants in an international diplomatic discussion about shipping, related to emissions from shipping, threatened them with personal penalty if they were to sign off on that agreement and therefore kill the agreement. So if the United States, at this point, at least in time, wants to kill something off, it can do that.
But there's a big question here for Australia. I mean, we are among, we're certainly the first and strongest country to back the war, apart from countries in the region. Still very much committed to AUKUS. I think we're seeing already, agreements like NATO on the verge of breakup mutually. And so at some point we have to make a decision. And of course this will also impact, as Katrina was saying, we've always been distanced from our own region by the perception that we're the deputy sheriff of the US. And so that conflict, I think, is going to become much more acute.
Katrina, you don't look convinced by what John's saying.
Look, there has been talk today from the US president about his attitudes to NATO and NATO allies. And I think that the alliance is under significant strain in a way it hasn't been before. And I think that there is, there are real tensions there. I don't necessarily see the United States walking away from NATO. I mean, I think there are still, while we see, on the surface or above the water, if you like, that iceberg of the major crisis or the major tensions, I mean, underneath, there is still a lot of business as usual, and both the United States and the European allies still have a great deal to get, a great deal of benefit out of a arrangement like NATO. And the US can't leave NATO without congressional support. And I think the Democrats are still, largely supporting of NATO, and I think some of the Republicans are as well. But I do think what we'll see in the future is something that's far more transactional.
I think that's illusory, and I think the word transactional is illusory also. I mean, it's used typically to describe Donald Trump, but the nature of a transaction is I give you something in return for something and you deliver. That's not at all a description of Donald Trump. I give you something and he says, thanks very much for that, please give me some more. There's no sense, and this is going to be, I think, one of the reasons we won't see an end to the war is that Trump, what can he do? He can't promise to say, I won't bomb you again. He's twice already brought the Ukraine into negotiations, and in the middle of negotiations started a war. So I think the fact that lots of people are continuing in low level, the generals are talking to each other, diplomats are doing, the kinds of things they used to, it undermines the fact that Trump has made it clear he won't defend Europe against Russia, and he now doesn't have the capacity to do so. The weapons that might have been used for that purpose have been used to bomb Iran instead. So I think, I don't think there's any notion of transactionality, and I don't think NATO can survive 3 more years of this administration.
So where does that leave Australia here? What are Australia's options? If this is the direction things are going, or if it's difficult to pick where the direction is, how do we know how to play the few cards that we do have?
Well, I think it's incredibly difficult because we built our force, the Australian Defence Force and all of our defence capacities around the United States, same as European countries. We don't have basically the kind of sovereign capacity to defend ourselves without being part of the US alliance that maybe some countries have. Many people have advocated for something along these lines for many years, to think a bit more carefully about what forms, what kind of defence systems we need, what kind of force setup we need in order to be able to do that. But that has not really been history for actually many decades now, and I'm not entirely sure whether politicians in Australia and many people in the administration and of course among the the higher echelons of the Defence Force actually can even imagine what that would look like. I think it would require such a shift from where we are now. It's going to require basically a root and branch transformation of our defence posture. But I think that we need to start thinking along those lines. And there are people out there that have ideas, what kind of capacities we need to build, how we can potentially build them. Of course, we've actually gone in the opposite direction in recent years because we signed up to AUKUS, which actually embeds us more closely with the United States. And I think the question we need to ask ourselves, and I think that's the question currently being asked in the Middle East by many countries, is the alliance actually making us safer, or is it making us less safe? Because if the United States is acting in these ways, it is possible for us to become less safe as a result of it than we would have been without having that defence umbrella. But we are very far away from having any clear idea of what that would look like.
John?
Well, of course, while that was true of the Europeans 2 years ago, I think it's pretty clear now that they have already and surprisingly rapidly disentangled themselves from reliance on the US, especially if you include Ukraine as part of Europe. Yeah, Europe produces more artillery than the US does, obviously massively more drones, has large numbers of tanks for what they're worth. The US is supreme in carrier battle groups, but it turns out, at least as far as a carrier battle group is incapable of bringing oil out of the Straits of Hormuz. So I think it's certainly true that Australia is still in this mindset, but I think it's also clear that reliance on the US to defend us, should we get into a conflict with another country in the region, which fortunately is a remote possibility, I think it must already be obvious that the likelihood that we could call on the US for defence is small.
But I think, while Europe is further away on the ladder of grief, if you like, the steps of grief than Australia is, I think to say that they've actually disentangled themselves from NATO, I think is taking it too far in my view. I think they've got a very, very long way to go to build domestic capabilities. And in fact, you can tell by the way in which, for instance, Chancellor Merz is reacting to this war that, there is real concern in Europe about losing that support from the United States.
My view is they want to string it out as long as they can. But the reaction, for example, to when Rutte, the NATO head, said something actually supportive of the war, he was pulled into line very quickly by numerous powers. So I think it's certainly true that the US is still supplying useful stuff, and that NATO wants to, Europe wants that to continue as long as it can. But I think they're trying to replace the US in every possible way in anticipation of the fact, which Trump has said quite explicitly in the last couple of days, that if you get into trouble, we won't defend you.
So to selfishly bring it back to Australia,
Yes.
where do we sit here? How do we play what we've got? And Katrina, I'm interested to get from you as how much we have to think with our, where the citizens of the world caps on, and how much we have to think with a protect home first hats on.
Look, I think that's a balance that we've always got to master, and I think Shahar is right. The watchword is sovereign capability, and not just in terms of defence capability, but in terms of our intellectual capability, our knowledge, all sorts of assets that Australia draws upon for its national security. So Australia certainly has to start thinking about that. It should have thought about it, I think, a little bit more seriously a long time ago. John, I agree with you, is quite right. I don't think we can call upon the United States in the way in which we felt we might have been able to, although I'm never convinced that alliance was as strong as many Australian strategists over the decades have thought that it is. But I think that the goal for Australia really has to be, the US alliance, I think, will outlive Donald Trump. It may transform and it may be different, But the alliance will be retained, but we need an alliance plus mentality, if you like. And that plus has to be about thinking about our relationship with the region and having a relationship with the region, particularly Southeast Asia, that is not mediated through the China-US lens, but that is about genuine partnerships that we have with the region. It has to be about a kind of pragmatic, national self-interest, but it also has to be about Australia really standing up and saying this is what our national interest is, these are the values that we stand for, and that we will not be deterred, by the actions of the United States into supporting things that are not aligned with our values.
But there's a very sharp conflict between those two goals. I mean, essentially, there's no way in which our neighbours are going to accept any kind of word from us as long as we have a bunch of alliances with the US in the name of it.
Well, that's not entirely true. There are countries in Southeast Asia that have an alliance with the United States as well, and the countries in Southeast Asia don't want to be dominated by China or the United States. So that's something that we can have in common.
Just to chime in here quickly, it's clear that the panel here has plenty to talk about on their own, but you can actually ask your questions tonight. So if you want to ask a question of the panel, I am reserving time for your questions. All you have to do is hit the Q&A box and we'll get to them very soon. I'm interested to sort of look a little bit to the future. I feel like we've done a lot of dissecting of the present situation and perhaps how we got here. What do we do now? How do we move forward from this? John, you mentioned before we should be further along in the energy transition. Is that something that should be a priority for us now?
Yes, and I'm not perhaps surprised but disappointed that the Prime Minister hasn't taken the opportunity to promote a reset there. I mean, the government came in very cautious and has stayed very cautious. This would have been, I think, an opportunity to say, we're actually going to do something about this, rather than to say, look, I'm sorry that it's costing a lot to fill up your tank. Here's 26 cents a litre to ease your pain. So that's something where I think we should be doing it. We've seen marginal things at the state level, like free public transport. I mean, pioneered by the Queensland Greens of all people. I suppose not surprising they would, but something that's become bipartisan policy here in Queensland and now been followed in other states. But in terms of any kind of action from the federal government, as I say, if it weren't for this crisis, they would actually be taxing electric vehicles in the forthcoming budget. So I think we are just totally behind the eight ball on this stuff.
What about in terms of our international partnerships and defence, Shahar?
Well, I think that the lead that we're probably going to be following is the one that Mark Carney set, and also European leaders were mentioned. I think that the mood that I'm getting is that everyone is now not necessarily reconsidering the alliance per se, but trying to hedge it a little bit. And I wouldn't be surprised if we are going to be making some steps towards building up some of these sovereign capabilities. But we are also deeply embedded, as I mentioned before, within the American force projection and structure in this part of the world. And to get ourselves out of that is going to be very, very difficult. But I think that this is something that clearly we have to start thinking about a bit more carefully, because in the event of, for instance, a crisis in the Taiwan Straits, whether by China or the United States or someone else, maybe someone in Taiwan, if something like that were to occur, Australia needs to already have a very clearly stated policy, not necessarily stated publicly, but needs to have a well-elaborated policy of how we're going to react. Under the current circumstances, it seems likely that we're going to be reacting by joining the United States, if they were to become involved themselves, but maybe that is not necessarily what we should be doing. But whatever it is, we need to really open up the debate in this country about our international relations and our international security posture, something that for quite a long time has not really been happening. I think it's beginning to happen now, but I think for so many years we've taken our current situation as a baseline and never sort of questioned anything below that. But I think the time is ripe now to have that conversation.
Katrina?
Also,
sorry, John.
Well, no, I was going to say, I think that's a very fair point. I think successive governments over the last decade or so has really lost its social licence around the issue of national security. I think they have a very risk-averse attitude or approach to having very honest and open debates about Australia's national security with its population for probably a range of considered reasons. But I think, recent research shows that Australia, there are, significant pockets of the Australian community who are ready to have these discussions, who are interested, and who have very important and worthwhile views to consider. And I think that if we can start, a sophisticated conversation around national security, that will do a lot for the government in helping to regain that social licence, but also get a strong sense of the kind of direction that we should be heading. And I think that is missing from the moment.
It's also important to remember that the only defence of the AUKUS program we've seen from the current government, which came in, is that it's going to create jobs for apprentices.
Yeah.
The Prime Minister has been very strong on that point, although when you look at this, we could build almost anything creating more jobs than submarines, that it's going to help the South Australian economy. They've always been sad about things. There hasn't been any word, any statement whatsoever from the government suggesting how the submarines might be used, even in the most vague possible terms. And indeed, to the extent there has been talk, it's of keeping sea lanes open. I think we've seen very strong evidence in the recent past that the use of naval force, including submarines, to keep sea lanes open is never going to happen. So what we have is a commitment which is absolutely written in stone for this government, but which has only been defended in terms that make no sense whatsoever in terms of a defence posture.
Yeah, and that's right. And that was a lost opportunity, I think, for the national security establishment in Australia to have that conversation openly and honestly with the Australian people. Now, I understand that there was another agreement that needed to be gotten out of before the AUKUS could be made public. And I appreciate there might have been those constraints there, but we can see the impact of that, as John has said. I think broadly the community is very confused about what the value of AUKUS may or may not be, and there are certainly, at least within Shahaz and my field, a great deal of questions and concerns.
So looking at where we are at the moment, one of the questions that was asked by people ahead of tonight's event was this idea of the word unprecedented gets thrown around a lot at the moment. It was unprecedented when we had a pandemic. We're now in different types of unprecedented times. Are they really unprecedented? What does history tell us, Shahar?
I'm getting the tough questions tonight. Well, firstly, every situation is to some extent unprecedented and to some extent not unprecedented, right? I mean, the pandemic was not the first pandemic. This is not the first war. But every situation is also unprecedented to the extent that we come at it in a very particular historical moment. So as I mentioned before, we're coming into this particular crisis at a point where we've had 40-odd years of very deep global economic integration. And while I take John's point that we've had lots of trade before, but just how tight the world economy has become in that period is something that we'd never seen before. Now, the reason why these problems are happening in a sense is because within the United States, the fact that a lot of that industrial capacity shifted to other parts of the world was not something that the American public, or parts of it at least, were willing to accept anymore, right? So in a sense, that is an unprecedented political crisis that emerged out of a particular, recent history of economic integration. So I guess what we can take from it is that we need to tailor our thinking to the very specific historical moment we're in. And there are a lot of historical analogies that people like to use. I mean, if I had $1 for every time someone said Munich for every international crisis, I'd be very wealthy. People like to bring these analogies out. They say, is this like First World War? Is this like the Second World War? Is this like, whatever, go back in time to, some people say it's like Sparta and Athens, And I think that we need to think about it in terms of the very particular conditions that we're facing. We do live in a world where everyone has an enormous amount to lose by fracturing in the way that we are, and this is what I was saying before. And our neighbours in Southeast Asia, they want to keep things roughly as they are. They might want to do a little bit better within them, but they don't want everything to turn into some kind of a bloc-like sort of Cold War. So we do have opportunities to engage with other countries and their governments, but we're also facing some unique challenges. I mean, we are at the mercy of all these different things that are happening, like, those sort of rolling crises in supply and energy that are the result of the vulnerabilities that have been created over recent times. So we need to think very much tailor our thinking to the moment we're in.
I mean, the big unprecedented thing is we've returned essentially to a monarchical system. All the major powers are now controlled by a single powerful individual who shows no sign of being willing to leave office anytime soon, and who is facing essentially no significant check. Putin obviously took a long time to get this position, as did Xi Jinping. Trump has got there very quickly. He's managed to start a whole series of wars. In theory, Congress might do something to stop him, but as long as he can retain control of Congress, that won't happen. Now, of course, all these guys have their vulnerabilities, but Trump again has made it clear he intends to stay in office indefinitely, and he may succeed, he may fail, but for the moment at least, we have a situation where when we talk about the US or Russia or China, we're making a category mistake. We are talking about there's no sense in which Trump's policy represents a continuation of a long-standing American policy. It's whatever Trump thinks is a good idea on the day.
I actually don't believe that Trump will be able to stay, and I think he's going to be checked a lot more after the coming midterms. He has not got the power to stop these things from happening. He is, brazen. He does a lot of things that people have not done before, but we have seen, a number of ways in which, as weakened and as hollowed out as they are, the institutions of the United States have made it a lot harder for him to achieve certain things that he wants. And I strongly believe that, the elections are going to happen and that he will be constrained by that.
It's certainly possible that he'll fail, but the fact is, the reality as we deal with it in April of 2026 is that we're dealing with a series of monarchies which, a couple of which are now very well established, one of which, as you say, still trying to establish itself. But I think it's entirely possible either that he will succeed or that somebody nominated by him, the classic pattern is a family member to follow. All these things are entirely possible, and I think we've suffered from policy. Our discussions of these things throughout Trump's rise have suffered from an assumption that things will go back to normal soon. In my experience, as the most pessimistic person I know in these things, I have never been wrong by being too pessimistic.
That's bleak. Katrina, what do you make of this?
Well, look, that certainly is pessimistic, John, and I can see why you think that. I do like to be a little bit more optimistic about these things. I'd like to think, as Shahar suggested, that there is enough resilience in American institutions, in the values of everyday Americans and the American citizenry to forestall some of that, and I certainly hope that that is the case, although I do understand the realism with which you bring to your argument. So my sense is that, my hope is that there will be some kind of corrective, but that doesn't mean that things will go back to normal. No. Things will be changed. And it'll be up to the Americans to figure out exactly what that looks like in 3 or so years' time.
John. Oh, sorry.
Sure.
No, it's okay.
I want to get to questions. I want to leave time for questions.
I think the best case, though, is Trump's failure doesn't mean a return. It means a long period in which the US has turned in on itself, trying to solve the problems created by Trump. I mean, even things like, do they rename the Trump-created institutions? Do they rebuild the White House as it was? Let alone, do they replace the Supreme Court with one that will actually defend democracy? If Trump falls, it's not going to be a return to Obama or anything of that kind.
I absolutely agree. I mean,
and so whatever the future is, I think the idea of thinking of the US as this country which you can more or less predict as in the way of, I guess, international realism, of it has a bunch of interests and it pursues them in a coherent way, has ceased to be relevant, and it's also true of Russia and China, that they are now at the will of the person in charge.
So I'm going to yank back control of the conversation now, because it's time to go to questions. We have lots.
Yes.
So I think we'll try to move through them as quickly as we can. Lindy's asking, is the continued investment of trillions of Australian super dollars into the US a wise move going forward? John, you're our economist.
So I don't know how much. I mean, there are, of course, a big bunch of options, and the general story of these things is that it's good to diversify. But you have to look at losing bets. a big set of questions here is kind of unrelated to what we're talking about, is whether the huge boom in AI, and particularly huge boom in AI shares, that is in fact justified, or whether, because that really is now such a large proportion of the US stock market that if it succeeds, quite possibly the US will be so rich that the failures of its government won't matter. If it fails, if it fails, that certainly would be very bad for Trump, but also bad for anybody who has money in the US stock market. So that's a problem. I mean, I think there has been too much of a tendency to think there's the gigantic pot of money in super, we can use it in Australia to do all the things we'd like to do, high-speed rail across the country and stuff like this. These things have to support themselves, so we can't, I think, treat super as a pot of money to be used for whatever we want. But we also do, I think, need to say it is a big national asset and we shouldn't just be allocating it according to a standard finance model.
If I can just one sentence on this, the problem is also there is no other massive pile of financial assets in other parts of the world that money can go into. The size of US financial markets is so much bigger, and US dollar denominated assets, just lots more of them. It's not like you can just take it and put it somewhere else because there's fewer of these options out there.
Dylan's asking, if Australia and other US allies need to de-risk from the alliance on the US, then where does Australia get its capabilities from, considering we have limited capacity to develop our own?
That's a really, really good question. I mean, that's a question for people on a higher pay grade than me. But I think that's a key problem, and I think that's one of the reasons why all of these different countries are hesitating. I can see that the European countries are trying to invest a lot more heavily in their defence industries that are far better developed than Australia, and maybe that's where we can go for some of it. That we should be able to develop some internal capabilities, but it's going to mean that our capacities are going to be potentially reduced as a result.
But also, I mean, a lot of the assumption is that we should have a capacity to do some stuff around the world, to project power. If we say, look, what we want to do is not be invaded, well, we have Papua New Guinea, probably not a big threat. Indonesia, 40 years ago, we were really worried about Indonesia. Now it's friendly, democratic, and still, of course, militarily less powerful than we are. We have a whole bunch of friendly countries between us and the nearest enemy, and the only reason it's a potential enemy is because of our alliance with the US. And I think the Gulf states are learning precisely this lesson. And we have, in a sense, we and the Brits and other people have bases in those regions which were supposed to promote some obscure national interest, which instead have turned out to be vulnerabilities. I think a view which has been very much the minority view is saying the purpose of Australian Defence Forces is to defend Australia against invasion. The capabilities for that wouldn't include submarines. They'd include lots of missiles, all the stuff that Iran
they include
and
submarines,
Ukraine
but
has.
not necessarily nuclear-powered submarines, because you can defend Australia with submarines with much shorter range if you needed to.
Yeah, and we don't. And submarines aren't really. Yeah, I mean, if you want to sink ships coming here, planes, drones, missiles, lots of other things are much cheaper than submarines.
Katrina?
Look, I think we also need to think a little bit more broader beyond the question of just invasion of our shores. I mean, the Australian Defence Force, in its current posture, does a lot more than simply just traditional styles of defence. They do a lot of operation, humanitarian response, disaster relief, all sorts of work across our region. And so I think that's worth thinking about too, how we develop an independent or a semi-independent both reputation and capacity and capability, and what the value of that is, not just for Australia's security, but Australia's national interests more broadly.
I mean, that stuff should be in the foreign aid budget. Yeah, we don't. Yeah, we've got a whole bunch of people who's trained at great expense, essentially to kill people. We have an incredibly weak foreign aid budget. This is the kind of thing, in my view, it's trotted out all the time, like saying the space program's great because we got non-stick fry pans. If you want non-stick fry pans, invest in the fry pan. And if you want disaster relief, have a special purpose, dedicated force, or whatever you want to call it, that does disaster relief.
So another question from Joshua, what are the perceived flow-on effects of the global oil price hike on agriculture and food pricing for the Australian public? Katrina, you touched on this before.
Look, that's not my question, I'm afraid.
It actually, it actually is addressed to Professor John.
So probably, there's a bunch of stuff to do with diesel and stuff like this, but the big threat really is probably fertiliser. It was already a problem with the Ukraine war, and lots of fertiliser being produced. That's going to, I think, be the place where we have a significant vulnerability. We haven't really seen good numbers on it, but I think if we do face a big problem, we've had the price of diesel go up and down, and it will affect things, and people will be unhappy. But if there's going to be a really big impact on agriculture, that's where it will be.
And unlike oil, which obviously the Middle East has a very large share of the global oil supply, but when it comes to fertiliser, it's a lot bigger. So I think that could have a bigger impact.
And again, it's worth pointing out that had we gone the climate route, we would have had an alternative technology for producing ammonia. If we had developed our hydrogen industry earlier, again, we would have a lot more self-sufficiency there.
So Clinton really wants you to talk about petrol. Clinton says, in the panel's view, should Australia invest in building a national strategic petroleum reserve rather than rely on other countries to meet our 90-day requirement?
I would say yes. I think that's definitely a good thing to have. I think there's been a lot of talk about that over the years. I'm quite surprised that we didn't do it earlier. I mean, as I mentioned before, we have this arrangement with the United States. It's yet to be seen just how reliable that arrangement is, but I think it would be better if we had it here. I mentioned before, we have some options if we really need to barter our way into more oil supply, but I think it will be good to be less reliant on the goodwill of others if we can.
I mean, the current government did essentially back out of that deal with the US and required not a national reserve, but required the various people that have petrol to store enough of it to last us 30 days. I mean, part of the problem is that this is incredibly politically salient without actually being super important. I mean, the worst case is we have petrol rationing. The older members of the audience will remember petrol strikes that lasted for weeks on end. We got through. I mean, the idea that having not being able to fill the car up with petrol when we want to, is a national emergency on a par with COVID, for example, I think is a mistake. So, and in some sense, it's disappointing. It's disappointing that the latest statement we've seen hasn't said, okay, now we know that we're doing everything we can, but we really ought to be using less petrol, bringing back, pushing in work from home, for example. Lots of easy things we could be doing to say we should be using less petrol, and down the track say, really preparing us for if we have rationing, well, it's really not such a disaster.
So I would like to sort of close by looking sort of inward and outward. There's, at the individual level, we're all worried about what things mean for us, what it's going to mean for us, cost of living, am I going to be able to travel overseas, all those sorts of things. And then your forte, what should we be doing as a nation? How do we fit into the world? We don't have a lot of time, but I'd love to hear from each of you what you think individuals should be considering and what the nation should be considering. John, I might start with you.
Oh, well, I think certainly we should be considering our dependence on petrol. I mean, I was, in fact, all set to buy an electric car when this happened. I thought, there's no point in going down the shop now, it'll be packed out. But so I've put that off for a little while. But I think we should be thinking about the extent to which our lifestyle is dependent on cheap energy, what we can do about that, and I guess then thinking about our place in the world and things of that kind. But I think one of the features of COVID was it shook up a whole bunch of assumptions. If somebody had said the Friday before, we're going to tell everybody not to come to the office, and said what will happen, I'm sure the answer everybody was expecting was chaos. And in fact, we did it almost without a beat. We all logged in. Yeah,
but most of the negative aspects of that emerged later on, not in those first few days.
The point I'm making more is that the assumption that you had to the way you did work was turn up to an office 5 days a week had been around for so long that it was taken as just part of the order of things, and it turned out that assumption was entirely false. And we may well find, if this crisis develops, if these events develop into a proper crisis, that we can live in very different ways, the ways we have, and still do well.
Our pessimist is looking for opportunities. That's lovely. Katrina, yes. How about you?
I think at the heart of this question on both the individual and the national level is thinking about what resilience looks like for us. So the question about, firstly, what are our values that we want to stick to and make sure that we remain steadfast on, both at individual and national level, but also what are our capacities to diversify and to pivot, as John was saying, to new ways of thinking, new opportunities and new ways of engaging in our everyday lives and in the world. So, on an individual level, that's for us all to decide. On a national level, I'd like Australia to sort of think about, again, what are the core values that we want to remain steadfast to in a time of rapid change and uncertainty and unpredictability, that we know Australia can remain steadfast to, but also what are the opportunities here to be able to respond meaningfully to these changes. And I think that starts with thinking again, about our relationships with the region, about our different forms of multilateralism, and making sure that we have genuine and diverse partnerships beyond the United States.
Shahar?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I think that my view is that most of the big calls are not at the individual level. I think that individuals obviously can moderate their consumption to some extent, but they're also constrained by the kind of economy that you have, the kind of job you have, the need to take your kids here and there, and there are limits to what people can do to change things in their day-to-day life. But I think that as a country overall, and I'm basically just echoing what my panelists were saying, I think we need to invest, we need to diversify, invest in our domestic sovereign capabilities when it comes to these really important things. If we want to diversify away, for instance, from fossil fuels, we need to make sure that we put a lot of effort into that. If we want to be less dependent on what is happening on the other side of the world, we need to think what particular things we need to have here and ensure that we put every effort into that, including, of course, investing in institutions such as this one, which is where most innovation...
Nice.
That's why they pay me the big bucks. No, but seriously, most innovation in the Australian economy, most R&D happens in universities, right? If we want to invest in our sovereign capabilities, this is the first place to begin. So these are things that we need to start doing collectively. It's fundamentally a collective issue more than an individual issue.
Well, we do have to leave it there. So we are out of time. Thank you so much to Shahar, Katrina and John for joining me, sharing your insights tonight. And thank you for joining us from wherever you're tuning in from around the world. It is always a pleasure to have our alumni and wider UQ community join us online for this series. We will be igniting your curiosity and unpacking topics that matter to you throughout the year. So keep an eye on your inbox for more online and in-person UQ Talks invitations. But until then, good night.